I am convinced there is more than sufficient evidence to demonstrate that attitude drives culture more than anything else. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is, if attitude drives culture, what drives attitude? Where does it come from? How do you make one? How do you get rid of one? How do you change one? What do you do to monitor attitude? How do you know if it's there? And how do you control the attitude that is there? Or, I don't know, change it into something different? I'm Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast. I have come to realize through quite a bit of study in just the way that the human mind thinks and the way that people communicate with one another. I like the way Dr. Caroline Leaf summarizes it better than anybody else. She is a doctor of neuroscience, so she is an MD. But if you ask her directly, what is it you do? She says, I am a communication pathologist. She says it like this in her book, Think and Eat Yourself Smart, but also in Who Switched On My Brain. She says, an attitude is what you think plus how you feel. So let me say that a couple of different ways. An attitude is like a mathematical equation. What you think, let's call that 2, and how you feel, let's call that 3. And so the equation is 2 plus 3 equals 5. So an attitude is 5. And if your attitude is 5 minus 3, your feelings, equals 2, your thoughts, or minus 2, your thoughts, equals 3, your feelings, we've got a pretty good equation now to understand how do we create an attitude? How do we craft an attitude? Well, we craft it by thoughts and by feelings. Now, here's something that you got to realize as a leader. Your job as a leader is influence. Nothing more and nothing less. I'm sure you may have other tasks that you have to apply your skills to, managerial tasks and organizational tasks and productivity tasks, and I get that. And all your skills have to come to bear on those. But your primary role as a leader is influence. It's not to make people do things. It's to inspire them to do things, to motivate them to do things, to cause them to want to do things in a different way. Well, if part of your task, which I believe it is to monitor and shape attitudes. Well, if our job is to monitor and shape and craft these attitudes, we have to know what the mechanisms are that create them, correct? Well, now you know, thought and attitude. So as a leader, your job is to influence thought and to influence emotion because that creates the attitude. The thoughts and the emotions both belong to whom? Well, you. They're your thoughts. They're your attitudes. They're your emotions. They're your attitudes. So if you have an attitude and you don't like it, guess what you need to change? Your thoughts or your emotions. If you have someone in your organization who has a really bad attitude, guess what needs to be changed? Their thoughts or their emotions. Now, don't get me wrong in this. I don't believe that it's the role of the leader to tell people what to think. I do believe it is the role of the leader to influence how people think, when people think, why people think, where people think. There's a great book by John Maxwell, you hear me talk about it all the time, called How Successful People Think. It's a great book, and it goes through a lot of different kinds of thinking and gives you some really good methodologies. One thing he says straight up is, do you have a thinking place? A place that you do your thinking. Do you have a time that you do your thinking? Why? Because thoughts, without time to think about them, thoughts, without time to consider them, to pound on them and ask yourself, is that really true? Or is that just a regurgitated thought of someone else? Did I just hear that from someone else and adopt it as my own? Or have I really considered that thought against my own core values? Have I really considered that thought against my own experiences? Have I considered that thought against all of the history and research and contemplation of other people who might have thought that thought as well? See, if we just adopt other people's thoughts, we run the risk of thinking other people's thoughts and living other people's lives. And if those thoughts are half of the equation of the attitude that drives our behavior towards success or failure, Now we've abdicated our ability to think, our right to think, and our responsibility to think to somebody else who may not be thinking at all. I mean, what if the thoughts that they gave you were regurgitated from somebody else to begin with? Oh yeah, we find a lot of that. We find a lot of that in schools and universities. We find a lot of that in areas where people only think as a group. They only think in what we call a group think. The individuals don't have thinking. They don't have the right to think. They're told, you're not allowed to think about these things. You're not allowed to expand these ideas. I love brainstorms that are genuine brainstorms where everybody in the room has a chance to throw out their own thoughts, their own ideas, their own imaginations. And everybody considers them all equally, regardless of the title of the person in the room. And they all kind of pound on those ideas equally and ask, does it have merit? Would it work? What if we tried it? Let's chase that dog to the end of the trail and see what's left. See, that's good, solid thinking. And that's thinking that allows you to think outside the box. It's thinking that allows you to move on with new ideas. It's also thinking that when it's laid on the table, sometimes you look at it and go, it sounded a whole lot better in my head, but now that I put it out there, that's really kind of stupid. Now, if I was in front of a crowd, I would ask you to raise your hand if you've ever had a thought that once you voiced it, even if there was nobody else around, once the words came out of your mouth, you went, ooh, that was a really dumb idea. Or what made me think to begin with that was a good thought? Now that I hear it out loud, I realize that is not a good thought. If I were to try to actually pull that off, that would be a really bad idea. Let's not go forward with that plan. If you're honest with yourself, you've had at least one of those thoughts. Now let's move on to the next part of the equation of attitude. The next part of the equation of attitude being emotion. So who's responsible for your emotions? I've told the story before of a client who fired me. And she's since hired me back, and we've been working together, 6 or 7 years since she fired me and hired me back. Since she hired me back, almost 6 years. But when she fired me, we kind of went through that time where I was like, okay, I'll move on with my life, and good luck moving on with yours. I'm cool with that. But she kept calling me back going, you don't understand what you did wrong. And I'm like, no, I understand what you feel like I did wrong, but how you feel about that moment, in my opinion, is a misunderstanding. And she finally said to me, but don't you agree that I have a right to my feelings? I said, absolutely, you have a right to your feelings. Absolutely. You also have a right to go stand in the parking lot and throw a hammer in the air 100 times and not move your feet. Chances are one of those times that hammer is going to come down and hit you in the head. Did you have the right to do that? Absolutely. Will there be consequences for exercising that right without judgment? Absolutely. See, the challenge a lot of us have is that we allow our emotions to be worn on our sleeve. We allow our emotions to drive our behavior. Why? Because we don't realize that our emotional response to something, unfettered, our emotional response to something, not judged by us, our emotional response to something never challenged or questioned, is a chemical makeup of an attitude. And we suddenly get that attitude and we react in a way that we now have an attitude. An attitude, my friends, drives behavior. There is no behavior without an attitude. And if you've ever seen someone express their attitude, a really negative attitude, a really hateful attitude, a really arrogant attitude, in their behavior, you know by their behavior, this is driven by an attitude. As leaders, part of our role is to influence the way people think, which will help them to understand the way that they feel, which will help them to modify their attitude, which will eventually modify their behavior. Controlling someone, I don't believe, is the answer. In fact, controlling someone almost never works. Influencing how they think, when they think, where they think, not telling them what to think, but encouraging them to think. Maybe even to think about what they feel. Now that can change a culture in a workplace, in a classroom, in a family, in an organization, in a heartbeat. Influence the way people think by influencing them to spend more time thinking, to get their questions out there, to brainstorm and share their ideas with other people so that they can really kind of pound on those ideas, and then influence them to think about how they feel, because that's what will drive their attitude. And as you drive their behavior through influencing their thoughts and influencing their emotions, the attitude will take care of the behavior itself. I'm Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast for Tell It Like It Is TV. Have a blessed day. Subscribe now for our extensive video library of leadership lessons promoting faith, family, and freedom.